number 61, and today we're going to do 5 different mitzvos: 61, 552, 557, and 58, and 570. And of course, the reason why these mitzvahs are so different, the numbers are different, that's how the order in which they appear in the Torah. And the Torah references various related subjects scattered throughout the Torah, and therefore we have one mitzvah that appears in the book of Exodus, 4 mitzvahs that show up in the book of Deuteronomy, and that's why those numbers are so off. But because they are similar nature, we like to lump them together for simplicity's sake. Mitzvah number 552 is the mitzvah to get married, marriage, the marriage ceremony, how it's done, why it's important. Mitzvah number 61 is what happens in the event of a consensual premarital intercourse. Mitzvah 557 and 558 relate to someone who forgoes courtship and forgoes marriage, and how they have to pay a fine, and what happens in the event that that union is finalized in marriage. Then that person would lose the ability to have divorce. And finally, 570 is the prohibition against formalized prostitution in the Jewish communities. So let's begin with mitzvah 552. It's the ceremony, it's the protocol of marriage, and then we can talk about various perversions of that normal system. So this is found in Parshas Kiseitze, the mitzvah, the parsha that has many mitzvahs in the Torah. It's a mitzvah, according to the Rambam, at least according to Sefer Chinuch, the book that we're using to guide us through the mitzvahs. It is a mitzvah for us to get married. The marriage ceremony itself, what we call today the presentation of the rings, that is a mitzvah on its own. There are opinions that say no, getting married is not a mitzvah, or at least it's not an independent, discrete mitzvah. It is what's called a facilitatory mitzvah, meaning that it's there to facilitate procreation, first mitzvah of the Torah, which is the mitzvah, and therefore anything that you do to facilitate a mitzvah is also considered a mitzvah, but it's not its own independent one of the 613. The Rambam, he is of the opinion that getting married on its own is an independent mitzvah of the mitzvah of procreation, and therefore it is counted in this list that we use to go through the 613 mitzvahs. Now I want to point out before we begin, and I know we point this out almost with every mitzvah, the average yeshiva student spends about a year studying this particular mitzvah and the related Talmud or Talmudic teachings about it. This mitzvah of getting married, the process, the protocol, the procedures of marriage, it takes a large part of the first chapter of Kiddushin, the book of Talmud of Kiddushin, and that's one of the first books of Talmud that students traditionally study, and therefore there's a lot here, and there's a lot to discuss, and of course we're only going to touch on these mitzvahs very briefly. Now the Rambam tells us that before Sinai, before we got the formalized Torah, what would you have? How would marriages happen? People would meet in the marketplace, and if he wants and she wants, they get together and they become a marriage, and they become a union. However, once the Jewish people were given Torah, we were commanded that in the event that we want to have a marriage, there has to be a transaction, there has to be some formalization of this union, it has to be done in front of witnesses, etc., and only then does the marriage happen. Now, what's the rationale for this? What's the reason? Again, every mitzvah has lots of reasons. And the ultimate reason why we do any mitzvah is because the Almighty tells us. But what is the reason that we can understand why you would have such a mitzvah? So the Sefer Chinuch, the book that we're using to guide us with the mitzvahs, he gives us 2 ideas as to what the value is to have a formal ceremony, which is done in one of 3 ways, as we shall see, to have a formal ceremony to consummate or to at least formalize this marriage. Number 1, we are commanded to do something, to have a ceremony that indicates the formalization of the marriage and the union before any intercourse happens, so that a man should not be with a woman as he would be with a prostitute without any formalization of any action before it. That's not proper. The proper way to do it is via marriage. A. B. The woman herself, once she becomes married, she's a married woman. Consequently, she is off limits to every other man in the world. Therefore, it's important for both him and her to know that now she is with her husband, and after this process is done, she's with him alone, unless he dies, unless there's a divorce, and therefore she should know that now she is no longer available for the rest of the world, and that's going to increase their love and their fidelity, and their relationship is going to deepen because now they know this is for real. Their relationship is going to be concretized. They have skin in the game. They're invested. They're committed to each other. I want to add that the modern practice of making a prenuptial is literally the opposite of this. It's literally trying to lessen the commitment and to lower the bar for someone to bolt, to have as many emergency exits available. And here we see the idea in the Torah that we should try to deepen the connection, deepen the bond, and that's why we have this mitzvah of making a marriage ceremony. And the Sefer Chinuch adds, this is again going back to the 1300s, a long time ago, he tells us that there is a tradition for the marriage ceremony to be done with a ring. And the ring is on her finger, on her hand, always. And that's going to remind everyone that she is a married woman and she is off the hook, or she is off the market. She's not available for any other man. Now, some of the laws of this particular mitzvah are as follows. Number one, there's 3 different ways that this can be done. The way that we do it is the man takes an item of value. It has to be of substantial value. It can't be insignificant. And he conveys it. And he gives it over to the woman. And he says, behold, I'm going to marry you. Behold, you're going to become sanctified to me. Behold, you're going to be betrothed to me. Any one of those words. With this item, with this ring, in accordance with the laws of Moshe, with the religion of Moshe and the Jewish people, he does that. He gives it to her willingly. She's willing. He's willing. It's an arm's length transaction. There's 2 witnesses to witness this. And then the marriage is finalized. She's married to him. He's married to her. They are now formally wedded according to halacha. That's money or monetary value. A similar process can be done with a document, with a contract, wherein the man would write in a contract that same message, convey it to her. She's willingly accepting it. There's 2 witnesses, and that would be also a kosher way to facilitate marriage. A third way to do it is via intercourse. This is intercourse that is done with the intention of marriage, and there the witnesses have to be outside for obvious reasons. But the person would have to say ahead of time, behold, I am getting married to you via this act in accordance with the laws, and the witnesses have to be privy, but not exactly there for obvious reasons. Now, the Talmud says it's actually not a modest way to get married. That's not a modest way to get married. And in fact, if someone does that, the sages will punish him. They give him lashes, because that's not the modest way to do it. The correct way to do it is to do it with one of the other 2 methods. And again, commonly we do it with the method of conveying an item of value from the husband or from the prospective husband to the wife, and that facilitates the marriage. Now, the Talmud, as the Talmud always does, is going to analyze the nature of every law with absolute profundity, turning over every stone analyzing every potential situation in a way that may make us ask the question, was that really necessary? So here's an example. The Talmud in the book of Prohibition, again, page 7a, asks the following question. Again, the appropriate text is, behold, you are married to me with this item, with this ring, in accordance with the laws of Moshe, with the laws of the Jewish people. She accepts it. There's witnesses. They're married. Suppose you have the ring, and suppose you have the witnesses, but the man alters the text that he has to say to facilitate that marriage. Behold, he says, what if he says, behold, you are married, not to me, but to half of me? Does that still work? Says the Talmud, yes, it still works. That's okay. However, suppose he says, behold, half of you is married to me. So not you, all of you, married to half of me. That's okay. What if he says, half of you is married to all of me? In that case, says the Talmud, she's actually not married. Now, the question that most people, I would say, who are not well-versed in Talmud, the question that everyone's asking is like, wait a minute, who says that? When would this ever happen? This sounds so unreasonable. No one would ever say that. Who would corrupt it? Again, the goal of the Talmud, when it has such questions, which you don't imagine in history is even happening once, is to explain a concept. And when you take that idea of conveying a concept by bringing the most kind of fringe case, it's able to convey a principle. But anyhow, the Talmud says there is a difference between this text, you are married to half of me, versus, then it does work, marriage is actualized, whereas if the man were to say, half of you is married to me, then the marriage would not be actualized. And Talmud says, wait a minute, what's the difference? Why doesn't the marriage apply to half and then spread to the whole? What if they say, well, half of you is married to me with half of this coin and the other half with the other half of the coin? There's lots of interesting cases, and each one of them, it opens up an entire vista, entire worlds into the seas of the Talmud. And I want to add that particular text, that particular question, dilemma of the Talmud, I had the great fortune of writing an essay, a Talmudic essay on it. So I have particular affinity for it. So again, we see that there is a concept of marriage. It's a mitzvah to do it. It can be done with one of three ways. However, there is the two preferred methods, and then there's the third way, which is not done. And that's the mitzvah 552 of doing a marriage. What about people who want to take shortcuts? Maybe they want other ways of fulfilling their carnal desires outside of the scope of matrimony. And that's where we're going to get the rest of today's mitzvos. The Torah is very, very strict about matters of sexuality. In fact, there are many, many mitzvos that relate to this drive. We're told in Leviticus, and actually twice in Leviticus, that if we start sinning in the ways of the Canaanites and do all these terrible sins, and the vast majority of them are sexual sins, then just as the Canaanites were bounced out of their land, so too God will abandon us and will spew us, vomit us from the land, because these sins are incompatible with God. These sins are so severe that if we want to have God in our midst, we have to make sure that we are okay in these matters. So what if someone outside of the scope of marriage, and certainly not done with these processes, what if they want to have a relationship with a woman? What are the consequences of that? So of course, if a woman is married, in Judaism, adultery is a capital offense. We've spoken about that, of course, during I think it was Mitzvah 35 or something like that. During the Ten Commandments, one of the Ten Commandments is to not commit adultery. If someone does that, it's a capital offense. If it's a close relative, it could also be a capital offense. Depends. There's different kinds of relatives. Even if it is not a capital offense, it is one of the most severe offenses, and that is kare, someone get cut off the Jewish people. Well, what if a woman is unmarried and she's not a relative, but you are not married to her? Well, then you right away have the problem. What if she is a nida? A nida is another woman that a man cannot be with, and that is a woman who is menstruating. A woman would need to purify herself according to Torah law before she would be eligible to be with any man. So if there is an unmarried woman and she's not a relative, so you don't have those problems, but you may have the problem of nida. Well, beyond the criminal consequences of such a relationship, there are several additional mitzvos governing the penalties that could potentially be levied upon a person, a man, in the event that they decide to engage in intercourse with a woman that they're not married to. So they would have to pay damages. There's the damage of shame, that the woman gets shamed. There's other damages, and these may apply in various cases. There's also the question of pain. Is the woman on board with this? Is she willing to partake in this activity? Is she not willing to partake in this activity? There's different laws detailing what has to happen. A man may also be obligated to pay a fine of 50 silver coins, and that may change with age. So let's get to the details of these laws. Suppose you have, this is not, sadly, it's not very uncommon. Suppose you have a couple of kids, they get into a relationship, they lose their virginities to each other. What now? So there is a mitzvah in the Torah for this relationship to be consummated in marriage. Now, the way that this is done, and the reason why there's multiple mitzvahs related to this, is that would depend on what was the nature of the original intercourse. There's one case, it's called seduction in the Torah. The man seduces the woman, she is willing all the way, and that would be one set of laws. What if the woman was unwilling to go that far? Then there's different laws that apply, even if the man is able to, so to speak, get consent subsequently, even if the consent is subsequently granted. If she was not willing initially, then a different set of laws would be in effect. If the woman was willing all the way, then they could get married, but that union is optional. If he doesn't want, if she doesn't want, then there's no marriage. Of course, in a normal case, marriage can only happen when there's willingness on both sides. The man has to want, the woman has to want, only then there's marriage. Here too, yes, they had a relationship, but if he doesn't want to marry her, she doesn't want to marry him, marriage is not being forced upon them. It has to be bilateral. And what if a marriage does happen? Then all the fines that would exist in other cases, they don't apply. And this marriage takes on the laws of every other marriage in the Torah. Meaning, if they decide it doesn't work for them, they could get divorced, etc. What if the woman was initially unwilling, she wasn't seduced, even if consent was subsequently granted? That case, the marriage could happen, but there's a different regime governing that particular marriage. She has all the cards. If she does not want to get married to him, he pays the fines, the various fines, damages, and all that, and they go their separate ways. If she is interested in marriage and he is not interested in marriage, then one of the laws of the Torah is that she could compel him to marry her, and he cannot divorce her. And that's mitzvah 557, 558. Positive mitzvah, negative mitzvah. Positive mitzvah is that you get married, and again, then the fines do go away. But she could compel that even if he's not interested, and he loses the normal ability to be able to divorce. Divorce, just like the marriage, is unilateral. If she wants to get married, she gets married. And if she wants to get divorced, she could force the divorce, unlike normal cases where things have to be bilateral. Now, of course, the Talmud gets into the various questions. How do we determine the exact nature of the consent, etc.? That's a big discussion in the Talmud. How do we know exactly, was this willing all the way? Was this partially willing, etc.? Now, the commentaries add that there is a very deep logic behind this mitzvah. Again, the Torah has a prescribed way of how to go about this. You want to make sure that there is marriage instituted ahead of time and everyone's on board, everyone's willing, everyone is signed on to this venture. In the event that people get a little frisky early, or there's a little bit of compulsion, in that case, that is someone going off script. And we want to discourage that, to dissuade that. And therefore, a man has to know that if he tries to go ahead and be a little bit too eager, then he may end up in a situation where he is forced to marry a woman that he might necessarily want to marry, and she has all the cards, and he won't even be able to divorce her. And that is going to be a very grave deterrent. And again, in the words of the Talmud, suppose she's blind, suppose she's lame, suppose she's ugly. She is not desirable to him. In the event that he gets too aggressive with her, he has to know that is going to be initiated, and therefore that would be a deterrent to ensure that men don't act too irrationally and too aggressively and control their impulses, control their testosterone a little bit. What's the word for that? It's the word I'm looking for. Dan knows what word I'm looking for. Control their instinct, shall we say. Okay. Control themselves. Mitzvah number 570, again, is very related to this idea, and that is the prohibition against having intercourse without marriage. And the context of that is the verse in Deuteronomy chapter 23, there should not be a kadesh and a kadesha amongst the children of Israel. What exactly is a kadesh and a kadesha? Is this a reference to any form of premarital sex, or is this only a prohibition against prostitution? That's a discussion in the commentaries. Rashi, for example, tells us that the word kadesh means a man who is always available for intercourse. And the word kadesha means a woman who is always available for intercourse. We would call that prostitution. The Ramban, he disagrees with that. He says, if so, then a spontaneous fling would not qualify. So he has a different way of understanding what exactly that means. But the Rambam explains that there's a distinct prohibition, 570, which is oriented around having an institution that is a formalization of indecency. In fact, he even adds that this is going to be criminally punished with lashes. So again, it's a very related mitzvah, and the Rambam himself explains how it's different. One of them is more like spontaneous, and one of them is when you have some sort of formalized institution of prostitution. I want to conclude these mitzvahs with a little bit of a perspective on this very important subject. Of course, we believe that physical pleasure, even carnal pleasure, is not something that we distance ourselves from. We don't believe in adopting an ascetic or monastic lifestyle, some Jewish ideal. We believe that the Almighty gave us pleasures to enjoy. Physical pleasures, of course, spiritual pleasures, even carnal pleasures, but to enjoy it within a certain context. And in fact, the Talmud actually says the following shocking statement in the book of Sota, page 17a, says Rabbi Akiva, a man and a woman, if they are meritorious, the Shekhinah, God's presence, is amongst them. But if not, if they're not meritorious, then a fire will consume them. And what this means is the Hebrew word for man is ish, aleph, yud, shin. The Hebrew word for woman is isha, aleph, shin, hey. Both of them have the letters aleph, shin, which spells ish, which means fire. The man has the yud, the woman has the hey, ish, aleph, yud, shin, isha, aleph, shin, hey. The words or the letter yud and hey spell the name of God. If they are meritorious, God is amongst them. However, if they're not meritorious, if God is not present, then all you have is Aish and Aish, fire and fire. If you take the names of God, so if you take the name of God outside of the name of man and woman, then all you have is fire, and that's going to consume them. What this is telling us is an amazing insight, that the peak holiness that we can attain is in marital intimacy. But in the event that that is misappropriated, then the fire of lust will consume us. And it's interesting that in the area where we have so much potential for holiness, that is precisely the area where the Yetzer Hara puts its crosshairs upon us. Wherever there is the opportunity for peak holiness, there's also the greatest likelihood of the Yetzer Hara interfering and trying to disrupt this holiness. You think about it, the holiest people that have ever existed, the holiest person that's ever existed is Adam before his sin, and he does his grave sin. And then you have the Jewish people experiencing prophecy at Sinai, eating manna, doing the golden calf. The greater someone is spiritually, the greater the holiness that they have, the greater the Yetzer Hara is. And even within a person, the greatest area of a person for connection to God, that's where you have the greatest attack, incursion of the Yetzer Hara. What's the area of the greatest human potential? We're created in the image of God. We could be like God. God is a creator. We could also create on our level. We could bring humanity. We can make new humans. What an amazing skill we have. What an amazing opportunity for holiness, for eternal holiness. The first mitzvah of the Torah, think about it. It's not by chance. First mitzvah of the Torah is to procreate. What an amazing opportunity we have to be like God. When the Yetzer Hara sees that, there's so much holiness that is specifically the area where he targets. Because we have so much opportunity for holiness, we have the effect of the Yetzer Hara trying to undermine that, and therefore we're given so many mitzvahs to remind us, here is where we can become great. Here is where we can become sensational. In fact, the Rambam even says, to the degree that a person overcomes his Yetzer Hara, overcomes temptation, that is the degree of righteousness. So we have these mitzvos. These are mitzvos that tell us the context of a very basic, shall we say, desire and impulse. And on one hand, we have a great opportunity for great holiness, and there is the likelihood of the Yetzer Hara trying to disrupt that in all kinds of different ways. And we have the mitzvos to govern us, to guide us, to make sure that we don't make grave blunders. My email address is rabbi@wolbe.com. You can email me with any questions, any comments, any feedback whatsoever. And of course, the floor is open. If anyone has any particular comments or questions, I'm happy to discuss them. I saw there were some chats there. If two people sign a contract with a rabbi and two witnesses, why does there need to be a ceremony in front of guests? There doesn't need to be a ceremony in front of guests. That's questions from Leslie. Great question, Leslie. There doesn't need to be, all you need, you don't even need a rabbi, to be honest. The rabbi is just there to make sure that everything's done properly. Technically, all you need is the witnesses. The witnesses are facilitating everything. It's helpful to have a rabbi because there's a lot of details of these laws. So it's very helpful to have someone who knows these laws to be able to shepherd this process. Can a man force a divorce as you mentioned that a woman could? Is that question in this context or in any context, generally? Generally speaking, divorces have to be bilateral. Generally speaking. Now, it's important to stress, biblically speaking, a man can divorce his wife unilaterally. However, it's been already 1,000 years since that was an additional law was instituted mandating that divorces have to be bilateral. So for all practical purposes, divorces have to be bilateral, but in this specific event where the marriage was initiated in this unusual way, then the divorce would be unilateral, but not from the man, from the woman. I saw another question in the chat. Is a concubine the same as a married woman? What exactly is a concubine? We don't do concubines anymore. A concubine is something that used to appear in societies where people would have polygamy, more than one wife. If you have more than one wife, sometimes they're co-wives, I guess, and sometimes there's kind of a primary wife and then secondary wives, which are concubines. But again, so practically speaking, that's something which has also been extinct for more than 1,000 years. So it's not one that people really need to know the details of. I don't imagine. I don't believe. Is there any country in the world that allows polygamy? At least not one that you would want to visit.
But what was that like with King Solomon and when he had multiple wives, which was allowed?
Well, you don't have to go back to King Solomon. Jacob had multiple wives, right?
He was pre-Torah though, so post-Torah. I mean, what was the?
Yeah, the Torah biblically does not ban polygamy. It doesn't.
What's the difference between his concubine versus the wives? What was his obligation to them?
I believe the obligations. I don't know. I'm gonna have to investigate that.
Okay.
If it's a regular marriage done in accordance with halacha, then it would not have. There wouldn't be any difference. I don't imagine.
Yeah, I would love to know that. My daughter asked me that. I didn't know the answer. And is what's specified in the ketubah? Is that Torah based or is that?
Yeah, the ketubah is actually it's a rabbinic institution. It's a rabbinic institution. Of course, part of the ketubah is mandated by the Torah, but the formalization of a ketubah is a rabbinic institution, which is why it's not a mitzvah in the Torah. It's not one of the 13 because it's not part of the biblical framework per se.
Okay, what about the relationship with Judah and Tamar?
Well, again, like Dan mentioned, that would be before Torah, but that would be probably under the context of yibum, of what's called levirate marriage. Not that that's a very helpful thing because levirate marriage just means yibum. But that would be in the context of a dead husband being the widow who doesn't have any children from her deceased husband. She's redeemed by a relative. That's like in the context of Ruth and Boaz or Judah and Tamar, wherein because his son, who's a relative of his, died without any children, there's an obligation on the relatives of the deceased husband to marry the widow. So that would be the context of that particular marriage, or union, shall we say more accurately.
So was it a marriage?
Well, it's hard to say. Hard to say because, again, that was before like Dan says, before the Torah. So it seems clear that they did not stay together after that one event. So hard to say it was a marriage. Did Judah divorce her? I don't know. It's a good question. Because typically speaking, if someone is together in a Levirate marriage setting, that would trigger an actual marriage. Yeah. But again, that's before the Torah. So it's only like the theory of it per se. There's only the theory of Levirate marriage. Because once the Torah is written, we know that it's not any relative. It's only the brothers of the deceased husband. Judah is the father of the deceased husband. So it's like the same concept, but it doesn't follow the same protocol.
Right. I did read yesterday that from the result that Yehuda and Tamar's two sons were the reincarnation of Yehuda's prior two sons.
Yes. Well, and that's the idea. The Ramban even says that. The idea of Yibam on kind of a Kabbalistic level is that the soul of the future child is going to be the same soul as the deceased husband.
Oh.
But that's beyond me. It's too advanced. You have to ask Dan.
I just repeat what I read. I'm just a parrot.
the Ramban says that. The Ramban talks about that he holds it the secret of the Yibam. Right. And again, that too is found in Parashat Kisei. We'll get to it. It's like Mitzvah 500 and something. We should get to before 2030.
What about the common from community for after marriage for a woman to cover her hair? Is that part of these mitzvot, or is that part of modesty and an application of that?
That is the Talmud talks about it, but it's not a mitzvah from the Torah per se, but it is hinted to in the Torah. And it's hinted where actually last week's parsha. This past week's parsha is Naso. It talks about the sota, the suspected adulteress, and the verse says that her hair is uncovered. If her hair is uncovered, you could deduce from that her hair was covered. So that's the hint in the written Torah that married women cover their hair. That's the hint. But it's not explicit in the Torah. But it's hinted to in the Torah.
Isn't it specified, though, in the parsha talking about Bilam and Balak looking down the encampment, seeing the closed-off tents, the women with their covers?
It is hinted to, in that particular story, Bilam and Balak, they're noting that the entrance of the tents are facing away from each other. I don't believe it mentions anything about covering hair.
Well, I'm thinking of the text with regard to Korach. And there was that, maybe it's from the Talmud with the one of the people dating his wife.
Yes, own the son of Peles.
Yes, and
his wife, and was sitting by the edge of the cave, and she uncovered her hair. And all the people came in to try to get in to join the insurrection. They're like, she's not covering her hair. They just hightailed out of there. And by that time, he woke up from his stupor. He was everyone was ready to die, dead, and the dust had settled. Yes, so that Talmud does mention as well, but again, it's not explicit in the Torah.
Okay.
But yes, that's a great. We'll get to it in a few weeks.
Okay.
You know my line about that, right?
No.
Okay, we'll have to wait a few weeks.
Okay.
His name was On. Right? On ben Peles. Right? What does it mean to own someone in English?
To own someone is to...
you were owned. What does it mean you were owned? You know what it means? Anyone wants to Google that?
To own someone?
Yeah.
Slave.
It's a slang. It's a slang. I'm going to Google it for you. So, of course, to own something means to possess it.
Right.
According to Google, informal. To utterly defeat an opponent or rival. To completely get the better of. Yeah, right. She totally owned you, man. Yes? So, own, his wife tells him, what do you have to gain? If Moshe's the king, you're nobody. If Korach's the king, you're nobody. That was her logic. Right?
Right.
So he's like, oh, what can I do? I told him I'll join. He says, well, drink something, go to the back of the tent, and I'll stand in front of the tent, and I'll make sure that no one comes in to bother you. That's the story. But the question is, his wife was saying something so logical that you have nothing to gain from this endeavor. What was he thinking initially? And that's the answer. It's in his name. He wanted to own them. He wanted to own them. That was the answer. He wanted to own them. Just to be partaking in a battle. It's like politics, right? You know, if your side wins the other side, oh, they were owned. You win. Well, what do you win? The Democrats are in power. The Republicans are in power. Regardless, you got to pay your taxes, right? Regardless, they're going to come after you if you don't pay your taxes. But we're convinced by our society that you have to join one of the sides, and that way, even if you have nothing to gain from it, you get to own them. That's my idea.
Any other questions before I stop the recording?
Yes, I have one, Rabbi. The story of Dinah and Shechem, where does it fit in these different categories?
Well, it would definitely fit in to someone who. Well, the question is, how willing of a participant was she? The Talmud says that she was eventually willing. But the question is, was she seduced into it completely, or was she initially maybe unwilling and then she bought in? It's not so clear as to the exact nature of it. But regardless, the reason why, the logic behind Shimon and Levi destroying the whole city, it wasn't because of that particular sin. It was the fact that that particular sin happened there was lawlessness, there was anarchy in that city. That's what the Rambam explains, that everyone has to have some system of laws. And a system of laws that does not stop people from committing crimes, maybe this is germane to what's happening in the world around us. If there is no law and order, if there's no justice, if there's no system to stop people from behaving lawlessly, then that is a violation of one of the seven Noahide laws.
The fact that Shechem wanted to marry her did not enter into it as far as the brothers?
Maybe. The brothers didn't want him. They didn't want him. They didn't want, so they duped him. But the sin of what Shechem did, that was not the logic behind what the brothers did to the city. The justification for the destroy of the city was the fact that there was no infrastructure of justice to prevent such behavior. Okay.
Right.
This was so fun. I don't want to hang up. I want to just spend more time with my friends.